October 12th, 1989, Confederate Air Force Oral History Center. Interviewer Margaret K. Wood. Time is 10:20 a.m. The interviewee is Wally Braun, B-R-A-U-N. He was in the Navy.
Right, the only service.
No,
I'm only kidding. Okay, I was born in Chicago, Illinois, March 22nd, 1921. Believe I went through a normal childhood. I attended grammar school, attended Harrison High School in Chicago from 1934 until 1938. Graduated in 1938. At that time, things were pretty tough throughout the country. Jobs were hard to get. Couldn't afford to go to college, so I did go to work. And held several types of jobs. Nothing really spectacular. For about 2 years, I became a machinist and worked for Bell and Howell, the camera company at that time. Never forget December 7th, because at that time I was playing semi-pro football, and we had played a football game and came back and got in the car and got the word of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Okay, so you were 20 years old.
Yes. Like everybody else at that time, I wanted to go down and enlist the next day. But it was amazing because things were still under peacetime conditions, and unless you were 21, you still had to have your parents' signature. So at that time, I had a grandmother who was very sick, and my mother said no, she wouldn't sign until, something happened with my grandmother. And about April of that year, I did go down and enlisted. But again, most people aren't aware of this at the time, but in the Chicago area, they had so many volunteers, and they didn't really have any place to send them to boot camp. So it was actually the middle of June before I was notified to report to boot camp up at Great Lakes, Illinois.
Were you jumping at the bit all this time?
Oh, couldn't wait. Couldn't wait. Anyway, we got up to Great Lakes, and the camp was still under construction. It was Camp Perry. In fact, there were no sidewalks, no streets really. Everything was dirt. And we had to wear white, so you walked in the dust every day, and we didn't even have hot water. You had to scrub the uniform every night. But at that time, boot camp was really very short. It was only 6 weeks.
You had to scrub your own uniform?
Oh, absolutely. Learned how to be a washerwoman right away. Anyway, one of the other funny experiences is the day I got up into boot camp, I ran into a neighbor, and he knew that when I was in high school, I had done some singing in church choirs and that, and he said, Walter, let me tell you, he said, people are going to laugh at you, but tomorrow morning they're going to ask if anybody wants to join the Blue Jackets choir. He said, step out, I'm telling you. So I did. Sure enough, we got laughed at, but got into the Blue Jackets choir, and it really turned out to be a salvation for me, because with the shortness of the school at that time, they were shipping everybody into the armed guard with the merchant marine. And all of us in the Blue Jackets choir got our choice. Well, I was always interested in aviation. I built models and that when I was young. So I got sent to aviation machinist school. And at that time, it was at Navy Pier in Chicago. So I reported there, and I believe it was October. And for anybody who's been up around Lake Michigan in the wintertime, we did our final experience out on a ramp right next to Lake Michigan when the wind was blowing in. It was about 20 degrees below zero.
Final experience, graduation?
Final hands-on, where we'd gotten through all the theory and that. They actually had some airplanes out there that we could work on and that.
Oh, my God.
And from there, I was then sent to the arresting gear school in Philadelphia. And I'll never forget when I first went there, the first ship I ever saw was an Independence class carrier. Well, having come from the Midwest, when I saw this thing, I thought, my God, that's so big, it'll never float. I went through arresting gear school up there,
How long did it last?
That was only 6 weeks. And then they sent us down on the Charger, which was the qualification carrier for Navy carrier pilots, for 2 weeks to get some actual training. And then I was assigned to the USS Bunker Hill, which was under construction in the Quincy shipyards in South Quincy, Massachusetts, up near Boston. So when I reported there, it was actually the barracks were right in the shipyard. The ship was still in the graving dock. It had not been launched yet. That's the big dry dock before they floated.
Okay, you're talking to Air Force person here.
Oh, okay. And I thought the Independence was big until I went down and saw the Bunker Hill. And that thing was just, it's hard to describe. It's 900 feet long, and it's probably about 15 stories above the water line. So when I walked up to it, my eyes just kept... Anyway, we started working there on the installation of the arresting gear. And the arresting gear is, what stops the airplanes when they land on the ship.
Well, now, I knew that much about it.
Okay, but somebody else might not.
That was pretty on the back there.
Okay, anyway, we were working there, and at that time they opened up the B-12 program, which was an officer program where they would send you to college for 2 years and you'd come out commissioned. So I took the test, and I was informed that I was number 1 on the list and took the physical. So I thought, well, this is great. I'm finally going to get a college education. But at that time, the Navy put out a stop order. Anybody assigned to a major carrier could not be released for any other duty. So anyway, went aboard the ship and went up to Boston. It was commissioned on May 10th, 1943. One of the strange dates is that the keel for the Bunker Hill was laid on December 7th, 1941. Anyway, we got the ship ready up there, and then we were ready to go on shakedown cruise to see that everything worked properly. And I'll never forget that experience because at that time we probably had just the nucleus of a crew aboard.
Okay, about how many were?
About that time we had 1,100 aboard, but about 5,000. Anyway, about an hour before the ship is ready to leave, there are railroad tracks right on the dock there, and these 2 trains pulled in. There were 2 train loads of recruits directly out of boot camp. So they came aboard, and we set sail for Norfolk, and that's when we picked up our air group. And at that time, we were the first carrier to take the Corsairs and the Helldivers. Helldivers had been on 2 others, but they wouldn't accept them. So we took, it was a new dive bomber. It hadn't really been proven yet, and they had a whole lot of problems with them. And again, it was quite memorable because the fighter group we had became very famous as a Skull and Crossbones outfit, VF-17. And when we were leaving and they were going to come aboard, at that time they had 36 planes in a fighter group. And these guys came out and did a tail chase. And then if you know the height of the flight deck, or the deck edge elevator, these guys all rolled underneath that as they went by. But we had the representatives from Chance Vaught and Curtis with us, so they were ironing out all these little problems as we got further into the cruise. We came back from the shakedown, went back up to Boston. The ship got all the final stuff done. And Curtis and Chance Vaught put all the modifications on the Helldivers and the Corsairs. So we came back and we picked up the air groups and we went through the canal. And again, it's hard to describe. They had built these carriers where we had called gun sponsons outboard of the side of the ship. Well, they were built on hinges, so when we got to the Atlantic side, we stopped and they hoisted all of these guns up on the flight deck so that we could transit the canal. And the carrier is so wide that when they let the water out, you could actually reach out and touch the sides of the locks. That's how close it was to the sides of the carrier.
I didn't realize the locks were that high, shall I say.
Yeah, it's really something. But then from there we went through and we went up to San Francisco. And at that time, then they put a whole bunch of Army aircraft and Navy aircraft on board, and about 5,000 CBs. They put temporary bunks up on the hangar deck, and everything was just so loaded we couldn't conduct flight operations on the way to Hawaii. Yeah, to get people out there on some aircraft. Then we got to Hawaii, and the Navy decided at that time, since we were the only carrier with Corsairs, that the supply problem would be too great, so they took them off, and we got F-6s. So a lot of the stories that the Corsair was not adaptable for carrier operations was a lot of bunk in 43. We then left, we went to Espirito Santo, and from there then we went into our first combat on November 11th, 1943. And that was at Rabaul. And it was the first time that the Curtis Helldivers had gone into combat, and they proved to be much better than the SBD Dauntless. At that time also, we had, out of the 5,000 men, I'd say maybe 400 or 500 had seen previous combat duty or sea duty. They were off the old Lexington and Hornet and Yorktown, which had been sunk. And about, we were just launching our second strike when the radar picked up approximately 100 and some Japanese airplanes coming out toward us. And no, we were traveling with the Essex, ourselves, the Independence, and we had 6 one-stack destroyers. That was the task force at that time.
Okay, I want to ask you something else. Now, when you launched, let's say, you got all these characters, and you launched, some of them go to attack, but it seems like some of them must stay in this area.
Right. Well, what they had done, our old BF-17 was stationed down there at Munda. So they were still carrier qualified, and they sent them out. When we launched our first attack, they sent them out, they landed aboard and refueled. And when it was time for the others to come back, we launched them as a combat air patrol. So we had about 18 Corsairs up there, and it was really a field day for those guys. They, I think, shot down something like 30 Japanese airplanes before it was over. And
were the Japanese pilots that bad?
No, at that time.
Were that good, or was it a different scenario?
I think our guys were good. Because at that time in 43, it was still the best of the Japanese pilots who were flying out of Rabaul.
That's what I'm saying.
But anyway, we survived. We had a couple of near misses and that, so that was our...
How you reacted to this?
Well, that's a funny story because, again, like I say, we were all green. Okay, I was 21. I considered myself a kid yet, but, you know, we had 7. So when we heard they were coming, God, we thought all these veterans were running around. They're putting on their life jackets and all of this. And boy, we can't wait. We're going to watch this thing unfold. Everybody's sitting up on the flight deck until the first Japanese planes came through on a strafing attack, and you couldn't see a soul. We learned real fast, you know, that it wasn't a circus out there. But anyway, from that point on,
Well, no, wait, did you have any duty?
Yeah, I was...
When you're not launching and retrieving, did you have...
No.
You didn't have a gun, you had to...
No, those were all manned. The only time we manned a 5-inch gun was when they were refueling the ship itself, because the gun crews were on the refueling crew, so we manned their guns while they were refueling. But other than that, we just, you know, were there in case we had to land airplanes in an emergency. We were all set up to do it.
Okay, where did you spend your time?
Okay, on the catwalk.
Okay.
I'm probably one of the people that would rather be out there where I could see what was going on, because one of the strange things, being up on the flight deck all the time, in the task force, when the 5-inch guns were firing, people down below knew that they were still pretty far away. And then when the 40s opened up, they knew they were closer, and when the 20s started firing, they knew that we were actually being, you know, attacked by Japanese. And it's funny now, but at that time you'd hear the guys down below, you know, come on, you guys up there, what's going on? Come on, you guys in the 20s, hit these guys, you know. And anyway, that started a whole series of events, and we became known as the Holiday Express, because it seemed like we always hit on holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, and the rest of it. And so we participated, the ship participated in every major campaign in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal up to Okinawa. And I was on it. Oh boy. Okay, major campaigns, and the Navy kind of worked a little differently. You would have a major campaign such as Guadalcanal, Bougainville, which could involve sometimes as many as 50 actions, but it was all classified as part of that. There was Bougainville, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshalls, Philippines, Hollandia, Iwo, Okinawa, China Sea, first raids on Japan in February of '45. Oh boy, I can't really, you know, but there were 11 major campaigns in the Pacific. And so we survived on most. A couple of the big things were the first raids on Truk. Now, Truk was like our Pearl Harbor. Yeah, it was no secret. Everybody was really afraid. Truk was a magic word if you wanted to scare everybody. And when it finally went, everybody thought, boy, we're really going to get our butts kicked. But we got in without being discovered and just, you know, blew the heck out of them. They never really came back to Truk. And the other big thing was the turkey shoot at Marianas.
Tell me about that.
Well, the turkey shoot at Marianas was really the last time that the real Japanese pilots were used in the war. They knew that we were really getting close to being up near the homeland and that, so it was an all-out effort. They were ferrying their planes in to try and get the fleet down there. And I think the Japanese lost something like 300 planes in the turkey shoot. And it was just called a turkey shoot because our pilots by that time, and we had so many out there, were just too much for them. And then the other interesting thing was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, when we eliminated the Japanese fleet for the last time, too. And the thing that made that interesting was we knew they were out there. We had the reports from the patrol planes that they had spotted the Japanese fleet. But they were just out of range of the carrier aircraft. So it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 1600, and they finally got a good fix on them. And they didn't want to really take a chance on losing them overnight again, and that's when Misher made the decision that we would launch, even though it meant that they were going to have a heck of a time getting back. So we launched, and that was, like I say, about 1630. And they did find the main part of the Japanese fleet. And our squadrons at that time got credit because they passed up the oilers and that and pushed on a little further. Well, when they came back, it was dark. It was absolutely dark. And that's when Misher again made the decision that the destroyers put on their searchlights and pointed them up so these guys would have some chance of coming back. And it was just, it's hard to describe. Everybody was just trying to land on whatever carrier. It was just, the whole sky was loaded with airplanes trying to find a carrier to land on, whether it was your own or not, because they were running out of gas. And when they did, you could see the planes going in next to a destroyer so that they could get picked up real easy. And we had a real bad incident. We had a TBF from the Hornet came aboard, and he cracked up in the barriers. You know, the barriers are the big things that come up so that if you miss the wires. So we're up there working to get him out of that, and held. Yeah, the pilot got out. The pilot and the crew got out. But they were entangled in the wire, so we're trying to get them clear so we can get some more aircraft aboard. And about that time, a hell diver, also from the Hornet, was coming up the deck and evidently did two things at one time. He ran out of fuel, and he evidently missed the wave off from the LSO, and he came down right on top of where the other one was. He killed the aero officer and about 40 other people. So it took us quite a while, to get him out. But we also had some real interesting, one TBF pilot ran out of fuel just as he was coming down the final, and he landed it without any power at all. And most of the aircraft that were lost in the Battle of the Philippine Sea were those that ditched. But next morning, they brought all the crews back, and we got new airplanes. The ways to get new airplanes in, they used the small carriers with the new airplanes on them and replacement pilots. So they launch them off of there, and they come over to where they were assigned, and you had your new airplanes and your new pilots. And then there was another interesting story. One of the destroyers, the CO of our torpedo squadron, had been picked up by them about a month before. He had to ditch. So when he came back up on their island structure, at that time everybody painted, how many ships they'd sunk or damaged. And they had a little picture of him painted with another hash mark underneath it. And also one of the interesting things, during a war, destroyers loved to pick up pilots. The reason they loved this was destroyers, mess halls, and that didn't have the facilities that a carrier did. So normally, if you picked up a crew, when you brought them back to transfer them back, you got like 50 gallons of ice cream and homemade bread and all. So they kind of fought for, picking pilots up because that was their reward, and they finally got something that made it worthwhile. Again, I think another real interesting aspect was the first time the Navy went up and hit Tokyo, which was in February of 1945. And again, it was kind of something I guess they decided they had to do, because they found out that even with the B-29 raids, they still weren't hitting all the factories and that they wanted to. So we went up there, and in February, Japan is pretty cold. And carriers mostly operated down, in the South Pacific, and heating facilities and that weren't too great. So the only people that had foul weather gear, or we had enough foul weather gear, were gun crews and flight deck personnel. But we went into Japan, and it was really kind of strange because we could see Fuji in the background. However, the weather was really overcast. We had a lot of snow and rain. So we would launch, and evidently the Japanese figured we'd be 150, 200 miles out. And the task force was running around under this storm, and we could watch them go out to sea looking for us and missing us the whole time.
And now I know you guys had some battle damage.
Okay. We came back for our first major overhaul in December of 44 at Bremerton, Washington. We went back out, and that's when we became Mischer's flagship. M-I-T-S-C-H-E-R, Admiral Mischer. He was head honcho for all aviation in the Pacific.
Land based mission. That's why I thought that's who it was.
He became we became the flagship. And this started, we went up to Japan and that, and then we went to Okinawa. And Okinawa was when the Japanese really started with the kamikazes. And at that time, it was really hush-hush, because we were getting 2 or 3 ships a day hit. We didn't lose any major ones, but they were heavily damaged. And it was on May 10th or 11th. Anyway, it was just about the time of our anniversary for commissioning. And we had been at Condition 1 General Quarters for about 72 hours, and they had just reduced it down to the next Condition 1 Easy. And the arresting gear shop where we worked out of was right below the flight deck, and that's where we had our coffee pot and all this. So we were down in there relaxing, and all of a sudden we heard this whoosh and a big bang, and everybody thought, oh God, somebody let go a rocket on the hangar deck. And we came out of our room there, and it was nothing but flame and everything else. And about that time, the word started coming. Clouds were real low. They had come out of the clouds, and we had, the first bomb went, it was an armor-piercing bomb. It went through the flight deck and out the side, exploded in the water. And then we got hit on the number 3 elevator and right next to the island structure, both by the bombs and the kamikazes. And the fourth one that was coming in, our ship's gun still shot down. My own experience at that time, we were right out, the twin 5-inch gun mount was right outside our shop. So there was so much fire, we went for a fire hose. And by the time we got it let out, it had burned up on us before we could even get water into it. So we just threw ammunition over the side. And about 5 of us decided, well, let's get out of here. Well, first we were going to try and get up forward of the ship because all the smoke and that was blowing aft, and we were right at the aft end of the ship. And we tried and we couldn't make it. It was too bad. And thank goodness we didn't, or we might have fallen into the holes at the... So we went back on the fantail, that's the stern of the ship under the flight deck. And at that time, a lot of people were jumping off because we could hear them abandoning the fire rooms. We had 4 boiler rooms, and they had abandoned 2 of them. And a guy I was with, and I said, nah, this thing is still floating. Let's stick with it. And about that time, 2 destroyers and a cruiser came alongside of us. And they passed some fire hoses over, so we were able to take the fire hoses and start moving up the flight deck again. And I think we fought fires for about 6 hours. But what had happened is that they were fueling airplanes and all the rest of it. So there was about a foot of gasoline on the hangar deck burning. And the skipper made a decision. He had to get rid of that. So he put the ship in a real sharp turn. And that turn was so great that all this burning gas flowed off of the deck and out into the ocean, and then that gave us a chance, to do something. A strange little note here is that Archie Donahue was flying a Marine fighter off the Bunker Hill at that time.
Well, another interesting thing is I have interviewed one of the Marines that was on the boat.
Oh, yeah? Oh, great. Anyway, like I say, it probably took us till 8, 9 o'clock at night before we were really secured. And I think the thing that bothered us most, and we knew why. We were smoking so much, we were just a target for the rest of the... So they detached us with 1 destroyer to start, heading back. And so the next morning, this was the worst part of it for me, was that when we started cutting the flight deck open so we could get down into the ready rooms, the first 3 people I found were buddies of mine out of, our division. And again, we just went ahead and worked at it, and I may be a little prejudiced, but I always hear how bad the Franklin was and that. And we actually lost, I think 350 were killed and about 500 injured, but the Franklin went back without doing anything. We cleaned the ship up. We cut all the wreckage and everything else off and cleaned it up so that we went back. We didn't look too bad. And we...
I want to go back to that fire. Don't you get awfully exhausted? Or are you so...
Adrenaline is just flowing so greatly that you don't feel anything. Tiredness doesn't even enter into the picture. I guess, again, it's the basic instinct of survival.
Okay, the fire goes out, and then what happens to you?
Okay, I say for about a week, and it was a matter of searching areas. We found bodies even...
No, I mean to you, though.
Oh, to me?
For a minute, yeah. You got this fire out pretty much in 6 hours, you think.
Okay.
Physically, what happened?
Well, physically you just collapse almost. Emotionally, I don't think anything really hit me, like I said, until the next day when we had to go in and start, recovering bodies. And then the next day, all the destroyers and everybody else started bringing all the crew back who had gone overboard. And then I guess it finally hits you, that what you've been through. And I guess at that time, most of us aboard ship thought, well, this is really pretty bad, but heck, considering the fact that we've been out here since '43 and we've had a couple of minor bomb hits and that, nothing, we've really been pretty lucky about the whole thing. And then I guess all of us thought, well, at least we're going to get to go back to the States again. And the prevalent feeling in the fleet at that time was the next one, and we knew this because Mischer's staff was aboard. Taters in the world.
Well, go back to cleaning up your ship. You said the next day you started cutting down into that.
The way the ship had been hit, it had actually gone, I'd say, about 3 decks below the hangar deck, down into the mess hall and places like that. Most of ours involved cleaning up the flight deck and the hangar deck. And I guess the best way to describe what happened on the flight deck, if you know aircraft, there were approximately 30 aircraft up there that had been fully armed and fueled, and all that was left was the prop and the engine sitting on the deck. And yet 10 feet behind them, we still had like 10 aircraft that weren't even touched. The hangar deck was strictly, everything down there was burned out. And since that was burned out, the ready rooms, which were right underneath the flight deck, the briefing rooms and that, were cut off because everything had been burned out. So the only way we could get down into them was to cut the flight deck out and go down from the flight deck into those rooms. Like I say, that's probably the worst part of it, because the bodies were just stacked up in there. They couldn't get out, and they had been either overcome or burnt or whatever. And 3 of the first ones I found were fellas out of our crew, and I heaved my guts. There was no way out of it, but like everybody else, we knew we had to do it, so we went back and did it. And coming home, like I say, we couldn't let anybody know what had happened. We got to San Francisco and dropped the air group people off there, some of them. And then we went back up to Bremerton. And they had the trains waiting for us. Those of us who were going on the first survivors leave, we had 30 days. So one of the things I guess people aren't aware, aboard ship out at sea, in the very beginning we used to get our whole pay, but you know what that led to, card games, and so you could only draw $10 a payday, and that would take care of your needs. So when we got back to Bremerton, we just had a whole bunch of money waiting for us, and really everybody's opinion at that time, those of us who were knew we weren't going to get off the ship, we were coming back to it, just figured we were going to go out and blow everything that we had, because if we went back out, our chances of surviving. So while the ship was in, it was just a good time for everybody. The ship was rebuilt, and we went out on our shakedown cruise, and then while we were there, about 10 days before the actual armistice with Japan, there was a phony one. Well, everybody celebrated, and then we found out it wasn't. And the day that it actually happened, again, was about 1600, was when we got the word. We were all just leaving to go ashore, and the sirens and everything started. And we figured this was it this time. But we got to the gates, and no military personnel could leave the base. We were trying every way we could to get out, because at that time we all had our wives up in the housing project. But about 8:30 or 9 o'clock, after all, if they let all the civilians out, then they let us out again. Yeah, that was a real celebration. Anyway, we started back down to San Francisco. And to get out to the Pacific from Bremerton, it's about a 60-mile trip up the Straits of Juan de Fuca. And about halfway out, the loudspeaker cracked, and they said, the following personnel lay down to the quarter deck with all your personal belongings. They read off a list of all of us who had enough points. They were going to put us off and discharge us. And again, that was kind of a funny experience, because we all got down there. Well, at that time, we all had parachute bags, and we had all our stuff in there. And the officer of the deck was a new young ensign.
It's bad news.
Bad news. And he said, those parachute bags are government issue, you can't take them. So most of us getting off were first class and chiefs and second class. You know, been in the Navy like about 3 years then. So I said, the hell with you. So we just took our mattress covers, just dumped everything in there, and away we went with them. We got over to Bremerton. They didn't really know what they were going to do with us, because the Navy hadn't determined how they were going to discharge or anything else. And we had a funny experience there. They put us in a barracks, and after 9 o'clock every day, we could go out. And one morning, in comes this young third-class new bosun mate and says, we're going to clean the barracks and all the rest of it. And here it's, E6 and above, and we said, hey, Junior, you want them clean, clean them. So it was really about 3 weeks later when they finally decided how they were going to let us out. And at that time, we had, about 5 of us had bought an old 34 Plymouth that we were running around in. And I can tell the story now because it's long gone and the statute of limitations ran out. But we had a cook and a supply guy and myself and 3 or 4 others. And rationing was really bad at that time. And the old 34 Plymouth had a back seat that folded down, and that was your trunk behind it. So we got a parking pass, and we parked near the mess hall every day. So we got our butter and our meats and whatever else we needed, but what we were really trading it for was whiskey. Because liquor was rationed up in the state of Washington. So we never had any problem, But I did drive that 34 back to Chicago when I got discharged. And then after that, I stayed in the Naval Reserve, and 1981 got out of the reserves. I was recalled in 1961.
Okay.
Okay, now that we've gotten rid of the serious part, we can tell you some of the fun things that we did and the ingenuity of enlisted personnel. First of all, in order to make some kind of liquor, on all the carriers, in fact on all the ships, they had life rafts that had wooden kegs on them with water in them. And you always got to know supply people and cooks. So you'd go down, you'd get some yeast, and you'd get some dried apricots or peaches or something, and you just put them in the barrels and let them ferment for a couple of weeks, and you'd have some nice brandy. One of the other things that we used to do is once you were out at sea for a while, you had to have powdered eggs. we had a little ingenious supply system of our own. Whenever the ships came out to supply the ship, everything was stacked on the hangar deck until they got everything aboard, and then at night they would close the hangar bay doors and put everything where it belonged. Well, the arresting gear hangs underneath the flight deck, so we had block and tackles rigged up, and we'd spot what we wanted, fresh fruit or fresh eggs, and about the time they were turning the lights out, they were going up to our... And then the pilots learned that we had fresh eggs in that, made our own hot plate and griddles in that, and pilots would come up with their little stocks of whiskey and trade a couple of shots of whiskey for fresh eggs, so it was always... And then the supply officer figured he was going to stop this. When the eggs came aboard, he was sitting on top of the eggs. Well, in the Navy, each division, on certain days, you took your laundry down for the whole division, and that was in a big laundry bag that was maybe 6-8 foot long and about 4 foot, and it took 2 guys to carry it. And what he was doing, though, he was sitting next to a hatch that went below the hangar deck, so as we sent our guys by with the laundry bag, there were 2 other guys that took a couple of crates of eggs along with them and put them back in the laundry bag and came back up. But, like I say, there were all kinds of ingenious things. So that's what made it, I know I talked to people who said the war was a terrible experience, and it was, but I still believe it was what you made it, and we still have ships reunions, and we very seldom talk about the bad parts. We talk about all the fun that we had.
Well, let me, like I